In the last section, we put together a ton of configuration inside of two different files. In this section, we're going to start to pull these two files apart line by line. We're going to first focus on the first two lines in each file, so specifically API version v1 and kind pod. You'll notice that the other file has the very similar same two lines at the top, but in the second file, we have kind of service. So again, we're going to focus on these two lines to get started. And just so you know, we're going to first, between the two of them, we're going to first focus on exactly what kind is referring to. All right. So just as we discussed a couple moments ago, we had said that with Docker Compose, we had created a configuration file to describe the different containers that we want to create. And we had done something very similarly over with Elastic Beanstalk as well. Now with Kubernetes, we do make these config files to make containers, but we had kind of honed in on that definition with this diagram over here and said that when we make a config file with Kubernetes, we're not quite making a container, we're kind of making something else slightly different. We're making something called an object. And so I first want to focus on exactly what an object is and help you get an understanding of what an object is. All right, so back over here. Okay. So we've written two configuration files. We're going to eventually take these two configuration files we put together and feed them into the kubectl command line tool that we installed a couple of videos ago. Remember, that is the kubectl command that we had ran at our terminal just a moment ago. Just a second ago, we ran cluster info, like so. So eventually, we're going to take these two configuration files and pass them into this command line tool. When we pass them in, kubectl is going to interpret both those files and create two objects out of each file. So the config files that we write are going to be used to create objects in general. The term object is a reference to a thing that exists inside of our Kubernetes cluster. And so we don't specifically say that we are making objects quite so much. In reality, we are making specific types of objects. And in this diagram right here, I'm showing you a couple of sample object types. So an example of an object would be a stateful set. Another example of an object would be a replica controller. These are all things that we can create inside of our Kubernetes cluster that have very specific purposes to make our application work the way we expect. Two other examples of object types that we're going to very frequently be using is a pod and a service. And you might have noticed that inside of our two configuration files, we have the word pod next to kind, and we have the word service next to kind as well. So the first thing to understand here is that the kind entry inside of all the configuration files that you and I are going to write is meant to represent or indicate the type of object that we want to make. So in our client-pod.yaml file, we are making an object of type pod because that's what we entered in for the kind property. In the client node port file, we are making an object of type service because that's what we represented for the kind property over here as well. Now you might be curious, what exactly is an object? What are they used for? Well, like I just said, they're essentially things that are going to be created inside of our Kubernetes cluster to get our application to work the way we might expect. And so, for example, every object that we're going to create, or every type of object, has a slightly different purpose. Some objects are used to run a container, as is the case with a pod. A pod is used to run a container. Other types of objects might monitor a container. Other types of objects, such as a service, are going to set up some kind of networking. And so we made an object of type service to set up some networking inside of our Kubernetes cluster. Okay, so that's kind of a brief overview on exactly what what kind service and kind pod mean. Now I want to tell you a little bit more about API version v1 on both these files. All right, let's see, over here we go. So when we specify the API version at the very top of the file, that essentially scopes or limits the types of objects that we can specify that we want to create with any given configuration file. So inside of both of our configuration files, we specified an API version of v1. That essentially opens up access to us to a predefined set of different object types. And so we have access, or our configuration file in both cases, because we are designating API version v1, we can create an object of type component status, or config map, or endpoints or event or namespace or pod or any of another of other object types that I'm not reflecting inside this diagram. If we had used a different API version, such as API version :app/v1, we get access to a different set of object types. And so if we had put in app/v1, we could have created an object of type controller revision, or an object of type stateful set. Now in practice, the API version flag is just a little bit annoying, I'll be honest with you. What you're usually going to do with any configuration file you put together is you're first going to decide on what kind of object or what type of object you want to create. You'll then figure out what API group that object type belongs to, and then you're just going to go look up that API version and stick it into your configuration file. So in other words, I knew that we had wanted to create something to create a container inside of our Kubernetes application. And so based on my knowledge, I knew that we needed to create a pod. So what I did was I looked up a document that said, hey, if you want to make a pod, you have to be using the pool of object types designated in API version v1. And so that's why I put down API version v1 inside my config file. It's because ahead of time, I knew that I had wanted to make a pod. So the reason that I say that this API version is a little bit annoying is that it's mostly a reactionary feature, and you just got to go do a little bit of reference to figure out what you should be specifying. Now, throughout this course, I'm going to be telling you in great detail about exactly what API version we're going to be specifying for every config file we put together. So you don't really need to worry about memorizing these things that much throughout this course. Okay, so at this point, we've discussed what API version means. We've also discussed what kind means, although we haven't really discussed what a pod is or really discussed what a service is. So let's take a quick pause right here. We're going to come back to the next section and expand on exactly what a pod is. So I'll see you in just a minute.